In this video, I want to talk a little bit about more piping and how it goes along with the fundamentals of refrigeration, and we want to talk about soldering and brazing. When AC and refrigeration systems are installed, they have to be properly sealed. Although flare fittings are widely used, most components are joined by soldering and brazing. The differences, as we've already talked about, between soldering and brazing is that soldering is accomplished with temperatures under 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Brazing is accomplished with temps over 800, usually between 1000 and 1500 degrees. Soldering is an adhesion process. The solder flows into the tube pores. Joining takes place when the solder hardens. Solder has a very low tensile strength, which means it's going to pull apart and break easily. It's not recommended for air conditioning or refrigeration systems due to the high temperatures and high pressures. Newer solder is available that gives the tensile strength of braze and lowers the melting point of solder. It's known as silver bearing solder. For example, Stay Bright 6 and Stay Bright 8. Both contain silver. When soldering, a flux has been used. Most common is soldering. So the proper cleaning, fluxing, assembly supporting, heating is necessary for soldering. You want to clean all surfaces to be soldered. You want to use clean flux on all ends. You do not want to overheat, and you want to have parts properly supported. The solder has a lower melting point than the copper being joined, so the solder should be distributed evenly around and in the joint. Heat the joint evenly, both tubing and fitting. As the flux clears up, apply heat directly to the joint. Capillary action will take place. That means the solder is going to be pulled into the joint using a proper fillet or cap. No globs or drips should be present, and then the joint should be cleaned with a cloth. Brazing is also a common practice and probably more common than soldering in HVAC. On large applications, you're going to use an oxyacetylene torch. Most day-to-day operations could be done with a plumber's torch and acetylene. Brazing is a welding practice. Unlike soldering, brazing can be done to join two dissimilar metals. Many different alloys or filler materials are available. Most common is 5% silver, 15% silver, or 45% silver. The greater the silver content, the greater the tensile strength. 5 and 15 is usually sold by the pound. 45% is sold by the troy ounce. When brazing, silver flux must be used. It cleans the metal and it acts as a temperature indicator. It assists alloy flow that prevents oxidization. So again, as with soldering, you're going to heat both the fitting and the tube. The flux turns a powdery white and then suddenly clear. Clearing is an indication of about 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. You want to apply the braze. Very little is needed. Capillary action will take place and it will pull the braze into a fitting. The braze will flow at around 1100 to 1250 degrees. As the flow starts, remove the braze and the flame. Cool the joint and clean to remove excess flux. Excess flux can hide a pinhole leak. Now, most often you're only going to use flux if you're brazing two dissimilar metals. When you're doing brazing. Brazing copper, a lot of times you're not going to use any flux at all. It's not required. Heating of the joint for soldering, okay, you got to be very careful. If you're heating at the compressor, do the joint closest to the compressor first using a wet rag or heat absorbing paste as a heat shield. Whether soldering or brazing, avoid overheating. Glowing red can produce scale. Oxyacetylene equipment gets extremely hot. It can also be used for cutting. Don't use it in a residential or rooftop. It's intended for a workshop or construction site use. Okay, there's different tanks available. Okay, we can have B tank or MC tank. Tanks can be an unguided missile if they're not properly secured. The tank is a lot of times under 2500 psi pressure. An impact as little as 15 psi can cause a valve to rupture. The tank cork is lined. The valve is opened only a quarter tank with a valve tank wrench. Acetylene is heavier than air. It can puddle on the floor removing oxygen from the room, resulting in an explosion hazard. Leak test each time a tank is first opened or changed using only a bubble solution. Always secure the tank, store and use it in the upright position only. There's two types of regulators, adjustable and non-adjustable. The adjustable, the flame is adjusted with the regulator, not the torch handle. The non-adjustable, the flame is regulated with the torch handle. Handle is not meant for fine tuning. All should be leak checked when checking the regulator. Tips are interchangeable. New tips called swirl tips give off a hotter flame for brazing larger tubing. Blue tip of the flame is the hottest point in the flame. For some general safety rules, wear safety glasses at all times. Never use pliers on any part of a torch setup. You always want to use the shutoff at the valve, bleed the hose, coil the hose. Light the torch only using a striker, or if your torch tip has a self-igniter, use that. Adjust the flame for different size tubing. You don't want to overheat things.